Every empire tells its story through victories, battles won, territories expanded, enemies defeated. But China's most consequential triumph did not begin with success. It began with collapse. In 1279, the Mongol Empire crushed China completely, overrunning what was then the most advanced civilization on Earth. For the first time in its long history, China fell entirely under foreign rule. From the outside, it looked like the end of Chinese civilization as an independent force. The conquerors sat on the dragon throne. Chinese officials bowed before steppe warriors. By every conventional measure of power, China had lost. Yet history took an unexpected turn. Within 2 generations, those same conquerors were no longer ruling China as outsiders. They were writing poetry in Chinese, governing through Confucian principles, and presenting themselves as legitimate Chinese emperors. The conquerors had not merely occupied China, they had been absorbed by it. This raises a deeper question that goes far beyond medieval history. How does a civilization turn defeat into dominance? How can a society lose militarily, yet still shape the identity of those who conquer it? And why does this pattern keep repeating, not just with the Mongols, but with later invaders, foreign ideologies, and even modern global influences? To understand how China operates today, how it responds to pressure, absorbs outside forces, and quietly reshapes them from within, we must begin with the moment it was supposed to disappear. Because China's greatest strength was never its armies or weapons, it was something far less visible and far more powerful, the ability to survive conquest by transforming conquerors themselves. To understand why China's greatest strategic victory began with defeat, we have to start by recognizing just how overwhelming the Mongol onslaught truly was. When Temujin united the Mongol tribes in 1206 and took the title Genghis Khan, he unleashed a form of warfare the settled civilizations of Eurasia had never faced before. The Mongols were not merely successful fighters, they were a systemized engine of destruction designed to break societies, not just armies. Their cavalry could travel extraordinary distances without supply lines, their composite bows pierced armor at ranges enemies could not match, and their tactics relied on speed, deception, and psychological terror. Cities that surrendered were often spared. Cities that resisted were erased as warnings to others. This was not chaos. It was calculated violence used as strategy. From Korea to Eastern Europe, entire regions collapsed in the face of Mongol expansion. By the time the Mongols turned fully toward China, they had already destroyed kingdoms that had stood for centuries. China at the time was divided, politically fragmented between the Jin dynasty in the north, the southern Song in the south, and the western Xia in the northwest. Each state was wealthy, administratively sophisticated, and militarily experienced, yet none of these advantages mattered against an enemy that did not play by traditional rules. One by one, Chinese states fell after decades of brutal warfare. The western Xia was annihilated entirely. The Jin dynasty collapsed in 1234. The southern Song, the most advanced and prosperous of them all, resisted the longest but could not escape the same fate. In 1279, the last Song emperor, still a child, drowned while fleeing Mongol forces during a naval defeat, marking the complete conquest of China. For the first time in its long history, all of China was ruled by foreigners. From every conventional perspective, this should have been the final chapter. China had lost its armies, its rulers, and its sovereignty. The Mongols now controlled the largest, richest empire on Earth. And yet, beneath the devastation, something critical remained intact. China's language, its bureaucracy, its philosophy, and its methods of governance survived the conquest. What looked like total defeat was, in reality, the beginning of a far more subtle and enduring counteroffensive, one that would not be fought with swords, but with systems. The turning point came not on the battlefield, but at the moment the Mongols attempted to rule what they had conquered, and it was here that Kublai Khan made a decision that would ultimately cost his empire its identity. Unlike his grandfather, who had been focused almost entirely on conquest, Kublai understood that victory alone was meaningless without stability. China was not a steppe confederation that could be governed through loyalty and fear. It was a vast agrarian civilization of more than 100 million people, bound together by taxation systems, land records, irrigation networks, and an administrative tradition refined over centuries. Destroying that machinery would have meant permanent chaos and rebellion, so Kublai chose the practical path. He kept the Chinese bureaucratic system largely intact, preserved tax collection structures, relied on existing legal frameworks, and ruled through ministries that already knew how the empire functioned. In the short term, this decision was rational and effective. The Mongols lacked the numbers and experience to administer China directly, and Chinese officials possessed the technical knowledge required to keep the state running. But this compromise carried a hidden cost. While Mongol elites retained military dominance and occupied the highest political positions, the day-to-day operation of the empire flowed through Chinese hands. Information, paperwork, revenue, and logistics were managed by scholars trained in Confucian governance, people who understood not only how the system worked, but how it shaped power itself. The Mongols believed they were using Chinese administrators as tools, yet over time, those administrators became indispensable. Authority slowly shifted away from the battlefield and into offices, archives, and ministries. The conquerors controlled force, but the conquered controlled function. To manage this imbalance, the Mongols imposed a rigid social hierarchy that placed Mongols at the top, followed by Central and West Asian administrators, Northern Chinese, and finally Southern Chinese at the bottom. These restrictions were meant to preserve dominance, but they also reinforced reliance on the very system the Mongols could not replace. By choosing to rule China through Chinese institutions rather than dismantle them, Kublai Khan ensured short-term order while unknowingly setting the conditions for long-term absorption. The empire remained Mongol in name, but the mechanisms of power were becoming unmistakably Chinese, and once that shift began, it was no longer something military strength alone could reverse. What happened under the Yuan dynasty was not an anomaly, but the first clear expression of a pattern that would repeat whenever foreign power entered China, and it appeared again with the Manchus in the 17th century. In 1644, Manchu forces crossed the Great Wall, seized Beijing, and replaced the Ming dynasty, once more placing China under foreign rule. Unlike the Mongols, the Manchus were keenly aware of the danger of cultural absorption, and they tried to resist it from the start. They imposed visible markers of dominance, most famously the Q hairstyle, enforced under threat of death, and attempted to preserve their language, customs, and identity through law and separation. Certain books were restricted, ideas monitored, and Manchu privilege protected. Yet even with these precautions, the same gravitational pull asserted itself. Governing China required mastery of its administrative system, its language, and its moral framework. Over time, Manchu emperors increasingly relied on Confucian scholars, revived the civil service examinations, and governed through the same institutions their predecessors had built. The clearest example was Kangxi Emperor, a Manchu by birth who ruled as a Confucian scholar king, studied Chinese classics, wrote poetry in Chinese, and openly declared that ruling China required adherence to Confucian principles. His grandson, Qianlong Emperor, went even further, presiding over one of the most prosperous periods in Chinese history, while immersing himself obsessively in Chinese art, calligraphy, and literature, producing tens of thousands of poems in classical Chinese. By the 18th century, the Qing court functioned almost entirely in Chinese, and the Manchu language steadily faded from elite use. The conquerors ruled for centuries, but culturally they were no longer distinct. This same dynamic reappeared in the 20th century with the arrival of Soviet-backed communism. Marxism entered China as a foreign ideology, carrying Russian theories and revolutionary models, yet once again, it did not remain foreign for long. Under Mao Zedong, Marxist ideas were reshaped to fit Chinese conditions, traditions, and historical instincts, producing a system that resembled imperial rule as much as proletarian revolution. In each case, external power entered China with confidence, structure, and ambition, only to find that sustaining control required adaptation to a civilization whose systems were older, deeper, and more resilient than the forces attempting to dominate it. This long historical pattern helps explain why China's most effective form of power today is neither conquest nor conversion, but assimilation through proximity and dependence, a force often misunderstood because it operates quietly. In the modern era, China does not need to defeat rivals on the battlefield to shape outcomes. It benefits from what can best be described as cultural gravity. Since the late 20th century, China has absorbed external influences at unprecedented speed, from Western technology and business practices to global finance and digital platforms, yet it has done so without surrendering political control or cultural core values. Market economics were adopted without political pluralism, innovation without ideological liberalization, and globalization without westernization. Foreign companies entering China adapt to Chinese regulations, Chinese norms, and Chinese priorities, not the reverse. Over time, supply chains, investment flows, and consumer markets align themselves around Chinese standards simply because participation requires it. The same dynamic extends beyond economics. Language programs, media exports, education exchanges, and infrastructure projects create familiarity and reliance long before any political alignment occurs. Countries that engage deeply with China begin to operate within its systems, its timelines, and its assumptions. This is not coercion in the traditional sense. It is accommodation driven by scale. China's population, market size, and manufacturing capacity generate incentives that pull others inward. The process mirrors what happened to earlier conquerors who found themselves compelled to learn the language, adopt the bureaucracy, and operate within Chinese frameworks in order to function effectively. Today's world is more interconnected than ever, which only accelerates the effect. The more interaction there is, the more influence accumulates. Concerns in the West often focus on military expansion or explicit geopolitical rivalry, but history suggests that China's most durable strength lies elsewhere. It lies in its ability to remain structurally intact while absorbing what it needs from the outside, reshaping foreign systems until they serve domestic priorities. This is why attempts to change China from the outside so often fail, and why predictions of China becoming fundamentally westernized have repeatedly missed the mark. The pattern that began with Mongol conquest continues in a different form. Outsiders enter with confidence, believing they will transform China, only to discover that sustained engagement requires adaptation to a civilization with its own deep logic. Understanding this does not require admiration or alarmism, but it does require historical awareness, because the same force that once turned conquerors into Chinese rulers is still at work, quietly shaping relationships in the modern world. History shows that China's most decisive victories have rarely come from winning wars outright, but from surviving them intact and reshaping what followed. The Mongols conquered China with unmatched military force, yet within generations they ruled as Chinese emperors. The Manchus seized Beijing, imposed their authority, and tried to preserve their identity, only to be absorbed by the very system they governed. Even modern ideologies and global forces followed the same path. Communism arrived as a foreign doctrine, but it did not remake China in the image of Moscow. China remade communism in its own image. Capitalism entered as an external influence, yet it was contained, filtered, and bent to serve a political structure rooted in far older traditions. This continuity reveals something essential. China does not defeat outsiders by resisting them head-on. It defeats them by outlasting them, by keeping its core systems intact while allowing external forces to exhaust themselves against a civilization that does not need to change to survive. For the modern world, this raises a difficult question. Military strength and economic competition are easy to measure, but cultural gravity is not. It works slowly through dependence, adaptation, and familiarity, until participation requires alignment. The West often assumes that exposure leads to transformation, that integration produces convergence. China's history suggests the opposite is just as likely. The more deeply others engage, the more they must operate within Chinese systems, timelines, and assumptions. This does not mean China will dominate the world, but it does mean that confronting China requires understanding how it has always exercised power. Empires rose believing they would reshape China, and each discovered too late that the process worked the other way around. The question facing the 21st century is not whether China will change the world by force, but whether the world can engage China without being quietly reshaped in return.